I'm really excited to introduce our next two speakers, as Sabina said, Colleen Dilenschneider and Jim Hekkers from Impact's Experience. And for those of you that are not familiar with it,
Hi, guys.
For those of you that
Hi
are
there.
not familiar with Impact's Experience, it's a global leader in predictive market intelligence and related technologies. So, we all know data is king, right?
Right. I remember for last year, your famous line that we all called onto was date your data.
Date,
Remember?
I even forgot about that.
Was so funny. Date your data.
Date, fall in love with your data.
Stayed with me forever.
So give me a second to introduce Colleen and Jim and do their roles justice. So Colleen is the Chief Marketing Engagement Officer at Impact Africa. She oversees multiple audience engagement initiatives on behalf of her clients, particularly in the nonprofit and cultural space. She uses data to both identify and predict emerging market opportunities and helps nonprofit organizations maintain their relevance and secure their long-term financial futures. What's awesome about Colleen is that she is a writer as well as a publisher, and you can catch her on her website, Know Your Own Bone.
I follow
that's
it
intriguing.
avidly.
That's intriguing.
Amazing, yeah.
And she's been featured as an expert in a number of different high-profile publications like the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, Colleen. And you're joining us from which part of the world?
Joining you today from Chicago. So it's
I love Chicago.
I know
love
you guys have
Chicago
had
too.
a long, great day. It's still the morning.
Well, welcome, bright and early. And Jim Hekkers, also from Impact's Experience, specializes in leveraging his extensive executive experience in the world of visitor-serving organizations to help leaders like ourselves in nonprofit organizations improve strategic planning, management, and market research. His expertise and his fascination with robust market research helps him facilitate strategic plans for his clients. He is also a very popular speaker, and we are so privileged to have him here, having spoken at multiple different conferences and spaces for zoos, aquariums, museums. And I believe you've also published a couple of books and articles, Jim. Hi.
Yes. No, I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And where are you joining us from?
I live in Denver, Colorado, just outside
Wow.
of Denver, near Boulder.
Wow.
Well, it's good to have you both on. And today you are talking about the power of data, but more specifically, who visits and who doesn't visit your attraction, and how you can use the power of market research to succeed. I'm excited.
Me too.
Yeah.
Over to you guys.
We're excited too. Thank you so much. First and foremost, we are so thrilled to be here with you. Thank you to everyone, to Sabina, to everybody with the African Association of Visitor Experiences and Attractions. We are just so excited to be here. And we've heard that you have had a good, productive, long and exciting day. And we hope that all of that tea and hopefully any sugar that you've just had the ability to have will kick up. And we are excited to dive into the data. So on that note, there was already a fantastic introduction to Jim and myself. A little bit more about us, as was kindly mentioned, we work for a predictive technology and market research firm. We specialize in providing high confidence data for cultural organizations all over the world, but most specifically, we, of course, are based in the United States. So we are believed to have the largest survey of ongoing research regarding behaviors and perceptions surrounding cultural organizations in the United States. And what we're here to talk about with you today is a little bit about the basics of understanding audiences and why this is so important. And as we know, you know a bit about this, and our hope is to really ground some of that information and give you a good setup to, after this fantastic conference is over, take all of the great things that you've learned and to help put them into play. Again, as was mentioned, I write a website with my wonderful colleague Jim here called Know Your Own Bone. And we share high confidence research every week. And then Jim, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Hi. Yeah, my name is Jim Hekkers. My sort of claim to fame as being the managing director at the Monterey Bay Aquarium for 15 years. I've had something like 25 years experience as an executive in nonprofit organizations, specifically aquariums. My role in this whole thing is really understanding how to put data into play. Colleen is really the champion of data and the best data explainer I've ever encountered. But my role is to really help people understand what it means and what it means in terms of strategies and decision making. And I'm really, really happy to be here. Let's just, again, just a little bit more about Impact's experience. I think we've explained quite a bit about what we do, but really our main thing is market research for cultural organizations. And what we try to do is help you understand perceptions, behaviors, barriers, and motivations. We've worked for clients throughout the US and many in Europe and in Canada and other parts of the world. What Colleen and I did before the pandemic was to travel around and put on workshops for organizations, helping them, number one, understand the data, and number two, put the data into play. So we're really glad to be here, and Colleen's going to take a few minutes and tell you where the data comes from.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. So we are talking about data today. Where does that data come from? Well, the data that we have, that we collect, and that some entities in South Africa and around Africa may collect, is ours comes from three sources. The first is that we are in market monitoring 224 visitor-serving organizations in the United States. So that includes everything from museums to botanic gardens to symphonies, zoos, aquariums, galleries, and the like. And again, we're watching 224 of them to get a sense of, are people liking what they're doing? What are they doing that's attracting people? What are they doing that's making people think more of them? What about what's making people think less of them? And a whole bunch of information in between. The second data source that we have is a study called the National Awareness, Attitudes, and Usage Study. Now, this is that study that I was mentioning before. It's believed to be the largest in-market survey of perceptions and behaviors surrounding cultural organizations in the United States. Right now, it is over 144,000 respondents strong. So it's a very, very large survey. And that allows us to drill down to different regions and see things that may be happening. Maybe something different is happening in New York than is happening in Nebraska. And that allows us to see trends and spot trends so that we can make museums and cultural organizations aware of those trends. And finally, our data comes from our partners. We are lucky to work with several fantastic partners in the United States, ranging from Stanford University to the Monterey Bay Aquarium to the Exploratorium to all sorts of really great cultural organizations, but also market leaders that allow us to publish and share some of their non-proprietary data. So as you are thinking about and looking into your sources of information, that's a little bit about us and what we do, in case that may be helpful to those of you who are partnering with similar companies, or you're looking to dive into even more research for yourself.
Good. So let's talk a little bit about why this is a good idea. Again, we're really advocates for being data informed and data driven, and there are a lot of good reasons for that, because what we've seen is that those organizations that are data driven and that pay attention to the data generally do better in just about every metric you can imagine. The quote here really sums it up quite nicely: that one accurate measurement is worth 1,000 expert opinions. So what are some of the things that being data informed helps you with? First of all, it really can help you increase attendance. It can help you reach new audiences and engage new audiences, which helps lead to increased attendance. Really critically, it helps you find out exactly what people want. And what's important about this, about market research, is that it lets you talk to people who aren't coming. Visitor research is wonderful, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but visitor research is really about the people who've already made a decision to visit you. Market research is about those people who haven't visited you and trying to understand why they're not visiting and what's standing in the way, what are the barriers. All of that really helps you use your resources much more efficiently and effectively. when one of the, and again, a really major advantage of this is that it helps you identify barriers or obstacles. What's standing in the way? Not only in terms of attendance, but in terms of people even hearing about you or knowing about you, or having even the basic awareness of you. And then finally, market research helps you understand attitudinal things like affinity and trust and credibility. And that's really, really important, because is what we're finding is that those organizations that really are good at pursuing their missions have higher levels of respect, credibility, and trust. Colleen?
And in a nutshell, what all of these things come down to is that it's all about understanding how people think and behave, right? Because when we understand what drives the decision to come into our museum or cultural organization's doors, then we can be sure to do more of it. We know what they want, if we know what they expect. In the time of coronavirus, if we know what helps them feel safe, all of these things can help us alleviate barriers. And again, just like Jim mentioned, the whole goal is to understand our audiences so that we can deliver what they want in order to motivate behavior. Maybe that's a visit, maybe that's monetary support, maybe that's being educated, being educational resources for schools, whatever it is. Uncovering data to help us reach that goal and motivate that behavior that is in the best interest of our communities, but also of our organizations. So one thing that we want to mention is, that was a great phrase that was used to open this, is data is king. And why is data king? Well, the reason why data is king is because we, museums and galleries and cultural organizations, we don't get to decide if we matter. Our guests do. Our communities decide if we matter. We can build something. We can build a stand for something. We can build something. And if nobody thinks it's important, then nobody's going to attend. And then it can't serve its mission at all. It is unable to educate and inspire audiences if nobody wants to attend in the first place. So again, that's one of the most important things is, we want to believe we matter. We believe we do matter. Our goal is to show people why and how we matter, because they decide by visiting or walking in our doors or supporting us. Now, the traditional way of thinking before we lived in a more technologically advanced world was traditional inside-out thinking. Now, what we mean by that was that we, the leaders of great institutions like yours, we would get together and we would sit and we would say, now, what exhibit should we have? What do we like to do? We're the experts. What are we going to decide to put out to people? Now, we call that's traditional decision-making. That's inside-out thinking. We decide that we're the experts. You are well-educated, well-informed professional experts. But we get to decide traditional thinking is we decide on our own what is best for our communities. And then we, on high, disperse it to the communities and welcome them in our doors. However, we're finding that in a more data-informed world, we are able to have outside-in thinking. What that means is that instead of us just sitting at a big table by ourselves and deciding what we think should matter to audiences, we're also now able to listen to our audiences. And that allows us to be, again, outside-in organizations. We hear what they want, and then we think to ourselves, does that help us meet our goals? Does that help educate and inspire audiences? And when we have this bridge, when we're actually listening and considering how our audiences think, feel, and behave, then we're better able to serve as that bridge to educate and inspire communities. And this is what being data-informed allows us to do. Without data, we are stuck in inside-out thinking. And data, in a really interesting way, is a bridge to our communities and to the people that we serve. And that's why it is so important. Now, just as Jim mentioned, there are several kinds of research. You may have heard about them. You may have even been talking about them earlier today. There's market research, there's audience research, there's evaluation. Well, there's a lot of different things to talk about here, but let's give you a brief overview so that you are empowered to figure out what kind of data you might need and what might be most useful to you. Let's start with audience research. Audience research is information about current and past visitors. Now, this is the easiest kind of information for us to get. And I might guess that perhaps some of your organizations might have a little bit of audience research already. This is data about the people who already go. And the reason why we might already have it is that it's the easiest to collect. We can collect it through exit surveys at the door. We can collect it on the street outside of our buildings. We can collect it through emails. We can collect it even on Facebook and social media, because the people who tend to be our audiences tend to be the people who already follow us. And those are the kind of people who like to go. So again, this is the easiest data to collect, and it's by far the most common. It shows the results of strategic decisions. So it allows us to kind of assess, hey, we had this great exhibit. Is it working? Are people liking it? Are people enjoying it? Are people satisfied with it? And it also helps us identify different demographic, psychographic, and behavioral attributes of the people who already visit and what they think. In other words, it lets us know about our audiences, what they care about, who they are, and why they're coming into our doors. Now, audience research is incredibly important, and it allows us to really hone our strategies so that we can keep people coming back and supporting us and cultivate a community of supporters around our museums and our galleries and what we stand for at our institutions and what we stand for. But the thing that's harder, the kind of research that's harder to get, is market research. Market research is less common, and it's a bigger kind of overall scheme than audience research, but it includes the people who aren't coming. It includes the people who we want to come into our doors, but we can't figure out how to get them into our doors. Now, it's harder to get this data because we can't ask them questions on the way out. They're not coming in the first place. We can't ask them questions over email. They're not on our email lists. We can't call them up and ask them questions. It is harder to reach these audiences. And thus, they are better for market research, for going out into communities or communities that are underserved by us or that we'd like to engage, and figuring out what they think. Because if we only rely on audience research and evaluation, then we're in a bit of a cycle about hearing all of the great things that we do and doing more and more of the same great things that only reach one kind of audience or the kind of audiences that are already visiting us. Market research allows us to expand our audiences. The benefit of market research is that it can identify unmet needs and show us a little bit about who's not interested and why they're not interested. Now, in order to be successful, we need both of these things, and we'll tell you a little bit at the end about great resources that you can use to get some of this information. You do not need to be a data fiend or a huge data nerd like myself and Jim to lead a data-informed organization. But when we talk about data and research, remember, sometimes we're talking about our current visitors, and sometimes we're talking about people who we want to be visitors, but just aren't visitors yet, and how do we get them to come in the door? So let's talk more about that. Let's talk about these people who are visiting and who aren't visiting. Now, we're going to show you the data for these four groups that we're going to show you. They exist around the globe, but they exist in different numbers. The numbers that we're going to show you today are United States numbers. We're just showing you those as a bit of some context so you can kind of see how things work out. Now, when we talk about audiences, we tend to think that there are the people who visit us and just the people who don't, and that there are only two kinds of audiences. And while that's true in a way, indeed, that is true in a way, there are actually four audience groups to cultural institutions. Now, we're going to go over what those groups are. The first is what we call historic visitors. Now, get comfortable with this slide because we're going to spend some time here. The first is this orange bar over here, furthest to the side. These are our historic visitors. These are the people who have visited your institution at least once within the last 2 years. These are the people who actually go. And when we ask them if they are museum goers or gallery goers or cultural organization goers, they say yes. And they let us know that they've attended recently. And again, in our data, recently means within the last 2 years. These are, when we talk about data, these are the people who attend. These are our audiences, these historic visitors. Now, one thing that's alarming that you can see is that in the United States, they only make up 16% of people. That means only 16% of people in the United States have been to any kind of cultural organization in the last 2 years. Now, what? That sounds so low. Why is that so low? Well, it's actually, if you think about how markets work and how economics work, it actually makes sense. One thing we know about the kind of people who go to cultural organizations is, well, they tend to be the kind of people who go to cultural organizations. The kind of person who's likely to go to a historic site is similar to the kind of person, and is often the same person, who goes to an art museum, who goes to a theater performance. So there's a lot of crossover in audiences. Now, again, these are our historic visitors. Now, the second group, this is where it's at. These are our inactive visitors. These are people who fit into one of two categories. Either they have demographic, psychographic, and behavioral characteristics that are very similar to our historic visitors, but they have not attended in the last 2 years. Or they just tell us that they are interested in visiting but haven't been, and specifically in the last 2 years. In other words, inactive visitors have interest in visiting us. They want to come through our doors, but for one reason or another, they haven't done that yet. Now, our goal, if we want to expand our audiences, is to figure out why these inactive visitors aren't attending and get them in our doors so that they become historic visitors, and we can kind of roll over and shift all 4 of these categories. Now, inactive visitors are really important, and you can see in the United States, they are the same size as historic visitors. They make up 16% of the United States population. That's a huge opportunity. And in the United States and across the globe in the data that we do collect, but specifically for the United States, as that's the topic I'm discussing right now, inactive visitors are much more diverse. They are of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. They are of different they have different financial means, and they are different ages. So they tend to be different kinds of people, and they tend to be our key to reaching new audiences. Now together, historic visitors and inactive visitors, we call them, ready, this is jargon, high propensity visitors. These are the 2 kinds of people in our country, in any country, who have any interest in attending cultural organizations at all. Now what that means is that there is a percentage of people, in fact, a big percentage of people, who just aren't interested in visiting us. Those kind of people, the people who are defined by having disinterest in visiting us, are put into 2 groups. The first is unlikely visitors. Now, these are people who know people who are inactive visitors or historic visitors, but they aren't going to choose to go to the museum, for instance, on their own. A good example of this, is if you think about something that you'll do it if there's social pressure, if there's a reason to do it, if grandma's in town and grandma wants to go to the museum, then this person will go to the museum. But they're not likely to wake up in the morning and say, I want to go to the museum today, because they've told us they're disinterested in museums. So again, these are people who are not likely to attend on their own, but they will go, and it's usually by social force or something that's related to social force. So maybe the museum is where the company party is. So then they end up going that way. Or again, grandma's in town or a family member's in town. So that's how they end up going. Now, it's a good idea for us to make sure that when they come in our doors, they have a fantastic time. However, it's also important for us to remember that they do not have interest in attending. And so while we want to make sure they have the best possible time and they tell their friends how great a time that they had, we understand that engagement by force is not a sustainable strategy. For those people who come in our doors, have such a great time and want to come back, they were not unlikely visitors. They were actually inactive visitors, and they needed an excuse to go. So it's important to remember that this is the biggest audiences, and this tends to be the largest portion of people. They're kind of just indifferent about museums. The fourth group, and one of the groups that we tend to think is even bigger than it even is this group of non-visitors. That is people, when we ask them, why haven't you been to the museum? They say, that didn't even occur to me. That's just not something I'm going to do. They don't know people who go to museums. They don't know very well. They don't run in social circles that go to museums. It's just not a part of who they are or the things that they're thinking about. Now, what you all may be thinking is, well, wait, how do we get these non-visitors and these unlikely visitors to become historic visitors who come in our doors? Well, the answer to that is that it is a marathon, not a sprint. Over time, it will be by activating these inactive visitors, getting them to come into our doors. Then people who are friends with these inactive visitors who are unlikely visitors will roll over time. The amount of people in each of these groups and hopefully make them bigger and bigger. That is our goal. However, it is not logical to think that we can walk up to a person who either doesn't like museums or doesn't have no interest in museums at all and suddenly make them love us. That is just not how humans work. It's not how free markets work. It's not how kind of economies often work. So over time, it's about little by little and building these communities and shifting these audiences. So one thing you may be asking yourselves now is, great, Colleen, you told us how important inactive visitors are. How do we get them in our doors? These are our key. This is our key to welcoming lower income and more diverse and in more physically diverse audiences through the door. It's activating these inactive visitors so that these other folks, non-visitors and unlikely visitors, see them coming, feel more comfortable, and we've changed our culture of who attends. Now, how do we activate inactive visitors? Well, we aim to remove the top barriers to attendance. What are those top barriers? Well, right now, dun, 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 it is the coronavirus. This won't surprise any of you. The coronavirus, of course, we are following the news and the things that are happening in your area too. It is also, it's a global pandemic for a reason. It's obviously, as you all know, a very big issue in the United States as well. We are seeing right now that people who love to visit museums are feeling uncomfortable going because of the pandemic, and they want to make sure that they can feel safe and that they won't put themselves or their families at risk by coming in our doors. And what that means is, first and foremost, before we go into the more traditional barriers, we want to pause and say, hey, know what will make your audience feel safe. And we have plenty of data about this for the United States over on our website, Know Your Own Bone. There are things like masks, limiting who comes into the door, allowing for social distancing. Those things are things that people care about and want to make sure that you're considering how you're going to keep them safe when they're on site. All right. Now, what about before the pandemic? What were the top barriers to people visiting? Here are the top three. The top three in the United States are, and oftentimes in other entities that we monitor, different countries monitor, is number one, first and foremost, for every country that we have data for, this is always number one. It is simply that they prefer to do something else. Yes, I want to go. Now, remember, we're talking about people who actually want to go. Yes, I want to go, but I only have one day off and I'd rather have a picnic with my friends. Or I only have one day off and I'd rather sit and watch television. Or I only have one day off and I'd rather have trivia night with my friends at a restaurant. Or I would rather read on my deck. I'd rather do something else. And yes, I do. I want to go to the museum. I simply prefer to do something else with my precious leisure time. And leisure time can be few and far between. That's number one. Number two tends to be things related to access challenges, related to the hassle. Those are things like it's hard to get there. I don't know where to park. I don't know how to purchase tickets. It's hard to plan. I don't know how to plan to be there. The building is non-compliant. When I get there, it sounds like I'll have to do a lot of walking, and I have a physical disability that doesn't allow me, that makes this, going to the museum a little bit more difficult. Those things tend to come in second in our research. And third is people saying, well, there's nothing new to do or see. Either I've been there before, been there, done that, scratched it off my list, or two, I'm interested in going, but there's no reason to go right now because the current exhibit that's happening or the current performance that's happening, that's just not of interest to me. Now, there are certain ways to get around these barriers, but the first thing that's most important to know is that these barriers exist. Now, other common barriers, some of you are thinking, where is admission price? Good question. For people who have interest in visiting museums in the United States, it's number 14. It is the 14th ranked barrier. Why is that? Well, it tends to be because the people who actually want to visit are used to paying for experiences. They're used to paying to going to concerts. They're used to paying to go into movie theaters. They're used to paying to go to sporting events. So to them, going to a museum, a price is not as big of a barrier because they understand that oftentimes you need to pay for these kinds of experiences and they already want to go. Now, this might be different in South Africa, but that is something that we tend to see here is that for people who want to go, there's an amount of cost that's already embedded in the decision to want to go. Other common barriers include scheduling. I only have one day off and I'm already going to see my family. I'm already doing something else. Work schedules, school schedules, safety concerns. All of those things fall into popular barriers to visitation. So the first key to overcoming the barriers is understanding what the most common and popular barriers are so that you can work to overcome them. Now, some of you may also be thinking, well, what about these unlikely visitors? What about the people who don't like us, who say they're not coming? What are the top reasons why they say they don't want to go to a museum or gallery or cultural institution in the first place? Well, it's important to know about those folks too, because again, over time, we want them to come back or to come in our doors. Now, the top reasons why people say they're disinterested. So people say, I don't want to go to the museum, for instance. Well, we say why. Here are the top 3 reasons that come up. First, the same one. I don't want to. I simply prefer to do something else. The difference is that for likely visitors, they want to go to the museum. They just rather do something else instead. For unlikely visitors, they're just kind of not interested in the first place. It just doesn't sound fun to them. So that's an opportunity for us to work on relevance, to find ways to connect and build bridges so that they can feel like this is something that I'm going to find exciting or interesting. The second reason is they had a negative past experience. Maybe they went to the museum when they were a child and they thought it was boring. Or they went to museum 4 years ago and a staff member was rude to them. For some reason, or they went and they found that the information there was inaccessible to them and they felt like they didn't belong there. Those negative past experiences are a key reason why people become unlikely visitors. Now, what's really important about this is that means that the decisions that we made yesterday are impacting our attendance today. And it also means that what we are doing today, if we're rude to people on site, if we have programs that aren't engaging, that will impact our attendance tomorrow. So it's important. It's often easy for us to think what we're doing today only impacts our attendance today. That is not the case. Sometimes we're paying for kind of less innovative programs that existed in the past. And the third reason, and this one is particularly, this is a really big one right now, especially in the United States, that's happening, but it may also be a big one there as well, is just attitude affinities. A museum, that I just don't feel like that's a place for people like me. I don't feel like people like me are welcome there or belong there or go there. That's not something that people like me do, whatever that means to them. It could be people of my, whatever that means, people of my income level, or people of my, of how my racial or ethnic, identity. It could be any number, or my physical ability or disability. It could be my age group. It could be my gender. It could be anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. Now, the key to overcoming these things, again, they're marathons and not sprints, are making sure that we understand that targeting groups, in order to effectively target groups, it's a good idea to invite people in and not just be free. Sometimes we think that being free is the same as being welcoming. Being free does not make somebody feel more inclined to go. If you feel like you're not welcome at a place, it doesn't matter if it's free. You don't want to go. For me, I am not excited to go skydiving. For some of you, you may love the idea of falling thousands of feet from the sky, but it doesn't matter if it's free. I'm still not going to do that because that's not something I'm interested in doing, even if it's free. So an important part of reaching new audiences and overcoming these attitude affinities, is what we're calling them, and making people feel welcome, is understanding that it's not just our admission price. It's also the programs that we have, who people see when they come on site, who leads us, and people seeing themselves in our leadership. And also making sure that we're sensitive to those communities, and making an active effort to let them know that we care about those communities and so that they are welcome. And it's more than just admission cost. So remember, 1, understand that there are more than just visitors and non-visitors. And you know what? That's okay, because the goal is, over time, to make there be less and less non-visitors and to roll over these types of audiences. There aren't just 2 audiences, there are 4 audiences that we need to keep in mind and to be constantly thinking about. And finally, let's focus on the people who do want to visit us, those inactive visitors, because it's by getting those people who want to visit us but maybe just don't feel welcome, or maybe just don't feel like it's a place for them, or for some reason haven't overcome the barriers to coming there. They'd rather have a picnic. Let's focus on motivating those people, because they are different kinds of audiences. And by motivating them, other people will see that we're motivating them, and we'll be able to eventually change up the kind of person who visits and make that circle even bigger. So let's talk about part 2. What can your institution do to become a data-informed organization? Now, for this, I am so excited to turn things over to Jim. As Jim mentioned, he is the former managing director of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. He has been leading, he was one of the first leaders in the United States to be leading a data-informed organization. I think he'll correct me, but I think he might have started becoming data-informed as early as 2006 or 2007, which is early to be data-informed now. And he's gonna take it away and tell you the kind of things that you need to do to help make these things stick.
Good. Thank you, Colleen. Yes, the Monterey Bay Aquarium was really one of the first clients of Impacts Research when I was managing director there. And actually, being data-driven was not an easy journey, but it was definitely a valuable journey, because the Monterey Bay Aquarium has really sort of risen to the top of the world in aquariums. And a lot of that is due to this commitment that we would really base our decisions on data and not as much on intuition. So in our research, we've really identified kind of 5 characteristics of organizations that are data-driven, how they got there. The first one is what's on the screen. It's this: the leadership needs to be committed to this. Market research is often challenging, and it generally challenges some of those long-held beliefs that we had, and it's really, really difficult to face that if the leadership doesn't commit itself to using data, getting data first of all, and using data. So although it's important for everybody to kind of understand this, it's vital for leadership to be committed to it. And that kind of leads us to the second major point, which is that in order to be data-driven, you really need to find a source of robust and reliable data, right? Like getting the data is kind of the first you need to commit to it. Secondly, you need to get it. And And by the reliable data we're really talking about is market data, because that's the harder data to get. Most of us do some kind of visitor research, or most of us understand our visitors because we see them every day and we talk to them. But it's really hard to get market research because we don't talk to those people, and our biases tend to center around those people who we do see in our institutions and who we target. And so getting really good data is important. Fortunately, in the last 10 to 20 years, the whole market research field has really improved in terms of being able to provide reliable data reliably. In other words, we've really seen improvements in methodologies, and we've really seen improvements in sampling and in kind of the advent of big data, finding large sample sizes and using them. The third important category is this institution-wide involvement and transparency. In the same way that data and being data informed rarely happens if the leadership isn't committed, it also rarely happens if the organization itself and everybody involved isn't involved and committed to it. And what that requires is that everyone be part of this journey, that data be shared widely, data be shared with staff in the organization, because those are the people who are making the decisions, and those decisions based on data will inevitably be better. And most important to doing that is being transparent. In other words, the data shouldn't just be in a sort of a treasure trove that only the leaders see. And that leads us to the fourth category, which is that organizations need to be open-minded, right? And that is so important in this data-driven world. If you study any sort of behavioral economics or psychology, we are driven by biases, right? We tend to see things, we make up our minds about them, and that's how we behave based on sort of our inadequate information. So it's really, really important that this be kind of an organizational value. Data often challenges conventional wisdom. Like it challenges those things that we've always thought are true. Most of us think that free days bring in people who wouldn't otherwise come, but in fact they don't. We tend to think that blockbuster visits are absolutely required to increase attendance. Data will tell us differently. And then we tend to think that discounting is the way to get people in the doors. Data tells us no, that's not the best way to get people in the doors. And in fact, that can actually be harmful and have negative implications and effects. Then finally, the fifth category is really confidence and persistence. It's like being confident in the data, trusting the data. I remember the very first time that the data sort of challenged one of our conventional beliefs in the Monterey Bay Aquarium. It was very, very difficult because people and this was really about the data regarding free visits. We had a lot of free days, and we said, that's how we get people in who otherwise couldn't afford to come. The data told us that, well, in free days, actually people had higher average incomes, higher education levels, and they have been there before. We weren't really accomplishing what we thought we were. It took a lot of confidence in the data to change course, because that was such a ingrained belief. And you don't do it unless you're persistent, unless you stay the course and you really commit yourself to getting data and using data, and then trusting data is really critical. So those are kind of the key attributes of data-driven organizations. That's kind of how you get there. But let's quickly look at another thing, which is how do you actually get this data? One of the problems with market data that most organizations bring up is that it's usually pretty expensive to get. And that's actually true, because the methodologies do require a lot of investment. But there are ways to get data kind of by partnering with there are things you can do inside the organization. First of all, we really, really recommend that you have a really good evaluations team, and that you actually do visitor data by doing intercept surveys and other kinds of surveys. It's really, really useful then to follow market research, and you can do that with things like Know Your Own Bone. If you're not subscribing to Know Your Own Bone, I would really, really urge you to do so because it's really helpful. But there are also ways that you can do this by partnerships and collaborations, right? Like if an organization can't afford its own market research, there are other ways to get at it. Partner with someone, partner with a university, partner with a grant-making entities. Foundations more and more are realizing how important being data-driven is to an organization, and they're much more eager to fund that now because they know that an efficient organization in the future isn't going to be asking for as much money because they're going to be much more efficient. Actually, now more and more associations of organizations are pulling together the resources to bring market data to their own kinds of organizations. If that's not possible, then create your own consortium. Find organizations that are like you and need this kind of data and share the costs. And then finally, of course, you can hire firms to collect, manage, and analyze data and market research. There are a lot of really good market research firms out there, and they're plenty willing to step up and help. Thank you.
And that's a great final point that Jim just made. Is that AAVEA, this association, can be a really great, not only connector to one another, but to data and to resources. So that's the same entity that brought us here is the same entity, this kind of community, especially now as entities strive to be even more data informed and especially learn more about Africa and South Africa. These kind of communities can be really hugely helpful. Now, again, this isn't your to-do list. This is overwhelming. I mean, it could be your to-do list. We like that if you're a superhero. But also, these are ideas just to show you don't need to be data nerds to be data informed and to make data informed decisions. You just have to have your eye open and be willing to think strategically and thoughtfully about the decisions that you're making and how you are making those decisions. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and take it away and let's jump into some questions and answers.
Wow.
We're blown away. We keep going, but what about this? And then you guys answer the question.
Literally answer the question.
But what about that? I wonder what that is. And then you guys answer the question.
Oh, good.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you, Jim. I think what you did was not only raise the overall energy levels, but you literally touched on most of the questions that have come from the people, the delegates that are watching, as well as ourselves, because we all consider ourselves, well, the two of us love data.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really, I loved your closing statement that you actually don't need to be a data nerd to be curious. And actually data is about staying curious about human experiences. And also there's a humility to the outside-in approach. It's not just about you and your little insular world. Look outside, what's happening around you. So I really love that. There was a question which I think you might have touched on, which you did touch on, Jim, which was around, you did kind of touch on it. How do you motivate people or respondents to engage with your research efforts? It seems like, especially now in this COVID pandemic climate where, focus is on survival and recovery, how do you still get data points from your visitors, from your respondents, if people are a little bit resistant? I don't know who wants to take that, either of you can.
Yeah. In terms of gathering the data, you mean in terms of how to...
Yes.
Yeah. Well, people are still willing to express themselves. The questions are, it's what's difficult in the time of Corona is that the biggest single barrier is, in fact, the virus. And so it's hard to gather data around some of those other kinds of barriers. But as we're seeing visitation come back to organizations, more and more those other questions are becoming more and more relevant. And then we have like this massive amount of data from past experience and past behaviors. So I think people are answering questions, right? It's just that the questions now are a bit different.
Yeah.
Colleen, do you want to add to that?
One thing One thing I've really enjoyed, I've followed your blog avidly, Know Your Own Bone, for 2 years, absolutely avidly. I think it comes through once a week, is that right? And obviously your tweets and things.
Right.
And although it's American data, a lot of it really resonates here. And I've said to myself, even if the percentages are way out, it's the sentiment that we can engage with and often the thoughts. One thing that really struck me, and it's something I've had a conversation here many times, is that providing free entry is not access. Access is something else. Free entry is something else. And certainly in South Africa, where we have a huge inequality issue, I mean, we're one of the most unequal countries in the world, we too quickly default into a free ticket, and I think that solves a whole lot of problem for a whole lot of subset of people. And there's absolutely not enough research around that. So I've really enjoyed your reminder on the different categories of visitors and how we shift them across into those spheres. One of the things that we have been talking about for a long time at AAVEA is collecting data. I have to say, in South Africa, the attractions industry has the least amount of data, partly, and I'm going to be straight here, guys, because you, our fellow members, are not sharing it, even when we ask. So until we do, we can't create something that's useful. And also, until we grow our membership base, we can't actually do some decent research which we could share. So this is something we all need to grow into and grow up about and take more seriously. But it really is fascinating. I mean, there was a tweet, for example, that said, "Oh well, I don't think the entrance fee would be number 14 in South Africa," but we don't actually know. That's the thing, and we haven't actually asked the question.
We don't have a definitive answer.
Yeah. So really food for thought. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? I see a lot of them have come through here, but you've answered all of them.
I would like to just maybe end off with one question that's come through. You both spoke about how it was important to create a culture of data curious people within your organization, and that culture needs to come from the top down. And potentially even building a department within your organization that kind of, gets the data. But where would you suggest that championing of data sits organizationally within the team? Where does market and data research sit?
Yeah. Well, it's really, what we've seen is that it varies around the country, but normally organizations have their own visitor research section, and more often than not, it falls under marketing because marketing is the most public-facing, outside public-facing part of the organization. But we've seen it in other places. We've seen it in exhibits. I have, at least. I've seen it in exhibits. I've seen it in education. I've seen it in a variety of different places. But it tends to, in my opinion at least, it tends to fit best within marketing. But again, it just doesn't happen unless there's a commitment from the top leadership. And we've seen this, people get frustrated at the lower levels of the organization. They're totally gung-ho about this and they're just really fired up. But yet, unless the top understands it, believes in it, it really doesn't, unfortunately, it ends up being frustrating.
Fair enough.
One thing that if I may add to that, one thing that we like to say is in your leadership, when the directors are there, when your leadership of your organization is together, we like to say, leave a space at the table for data when you're making decisions. Leave a space at the table for data.
Love that.
Yeah, and it's for as Jim mentioned, if you have it's also important to know your own culture of your own institution, because if you have somebody who's collecting really diligent data or any data at all, and you've found a finding, but the leadership doesn't have that space at the table for data, then all of the data that you've collected doesn't matter, because the person is just going to say, well, I think, and make a gut-based decision that may not be based on data. So we like to say, leave a seat at the table for data.
Love that. That is a beautiful parting thought. As you said, one accurate measurement is worth 1,000 expert opinions, and God knows we are surrounded by expert opinions. And on that note, we want to thank you both for joining us all the way from Chicago, my favorite city, and Denver. Yay. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Congratulations on a great conference, everyone. Thank you so much.